Meet Bill Thompson, a tough, cynical cab driver who spent years letting bitterness cloud his view of the world. One night, a simple cab ride to the hospital introduces him to a young man who changes his life in ways he never could have imagined. Bill dismisses the passenger as just another fare, but when he discovers the man's true identity, his entire perspective is shaken to the core. Now, faced with the consequences of his actions, Bill must confront the walls he's built around himself and make a choice that could redefine his future. Will Bill find a way to escape his bitterness and embrace the power of kindness? Or will he let his past mistakes keep him trapped in a life of resentment? If you're ready for a story about growth, second chances, and the unexpected connections that can change our lives, stick around to see how Bill's journey unfolds. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this. And let us know in the comments how you feel about Bill's choices. Let's dive in. The days all blurred together for Bill Thompson. Each morning, he would wake up to the sound of the same alarm, the same creaking groan as he rolled out of bed, joints stiff from years of sitting behind the wheel. He'd shuffle into the kitchen, pour himself a cup of stale coffee, and stare out the window of his one-bedroom apartment, watching the Chicago streets below with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Something that felt like resentment mixed with exhaustion. Bill was a man who had lived through his share of disappointments. In his early 20s, he had worked construction, dreaming of one day owning his own contracting company. He had built calluses on his hands, worked long hours, saved what little he could, and dreamed of something bigger. But life, he liked to say, was a cruel teacher. When his back gave out, the dreams of construction left with it, and he'd turned to driving cabs as a way to pay the bills. By now, in his 50s, Bill had grown bitter. His once muscular frame had softened over the years, his posture slumping as if he carried the weight of every setback, every broken promise he'd ever endured. His hair was thinning under his battered Cubs cap, and his once sharp blue eyes had dulled with time, becoming mirrors of the cynicism he now wore like armor. Even his cab, a well-worn sedan with a cracked dashboard and a temperamental radio, seemed to reflect the wear and tear of his spirit. The only real bright spot in Bill's life had been Laura, his wife, who had passed away nearly a decade earlier. She'd been kind, gentle, a warm counterbalance to his hard edges. After she was gone, the world had felt colder, harsher, and any softness he'd once held had faded with her. She'd left him with advice he couldn't seem to shake. Bill, don't let the world make you hard. Kindness is free. Remember that. But as far as he was concerned, kindness was a luxury that a man like him could no longer afford. Over the years, he had developed a habit of collecting grudges, cataloging each perceived slight from passengers who didn't tip, who treated him as nothing more than part of the car. He kept them tucked away, tiny grievances that, in his mind, justified his bitterness. Bill's cab wasn't just a car, it was his fortress. Behind the wheel, he was in control. The minute someone climbed into the back seat, they entered his territory, and he treated each passenger with a careful coldness that said, "Don't get too comfortable." So, when his screen lit up one late evening with a pickup request from a low-income part of town, a quiet, run-down street near Montrose, Bill felt a familiar rise of irritation. "Great," he muttered, twisting the cap on his coffee thermos a little too hard. Another fare from the middle of nowhere. He glanced at the address on his screen, noting the request had come in around midnight. Midnight fares in a rough neighborhood often meant trouble. He turned on the meter, grumbling under his breath as he pulled out into the cold, empty streets of Chicago. This wasn't the type of fare he wanted, but work was work, and he couldn't afford to turn down a fare, no matter how inconvenient. The drive to West Montrose was quiet, the streets mostly empty aside from the occasional straggler wandering home. Streetlights cast dim halos on the sidewalks, illuminating patches of cracked pavement and weathered buildings. Bill gripped the wheel a little tighter as he turned onto the block, his eyes scanning for signs of movement. He pulled up in front of the address, a dilapidated brick apartment building with graffiti on the walls and peeling paint around the windows. A few lights flickered on inside, casting shadows that made the building look even more worn down. He squinted, waiting for his passenger, but saw no one. A few minutes passed, and Bill's impatience grew. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, watching the clock on the dashboard tick by. Finally, he saw a figure emerge from the building, a tall, young black man who looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He was dressed simply in jeans and a faded t-shirt, but there was something off about the way he moved. His shoulders were hunched, and he clutched his stomach as he made his way toward the cab, his face tight with pain. Bill watched him approach, his initial skepticism deepening. The young man's face was pale, his eyes slightly unfocused, as if he were concentrating on each step. Bill rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath, "Here we go. Another one looking for a cheap ride." As the man reached the cab and opened the door, he slid into the back seat with a heavy sigh, clearly struggling to hold himself together. "Thanks. I need to get to the hospital," he managed to say, his voice strained and weak. Bill raised an eyebrow, meeting the man's gaze in the rearview mirror. "Hospital, huh? Couldn't just call an ambulance?" The question came out sharper than he intended, a reflex that masked the flicker of concern he felt. The man shook his head slightly, his jaw clenched. I just didn't want to wait. I need to get there as soon as possible." Bill's eyes narrowed. He'd heard similar excuses before from people looking to avoid paying for an ambulance. He'd driven his share of people with supposed emergencies that turned out to be nothing but drama. "Right," he muttered, reluctantly putting the cab in gear. "Well, don't throw up in my car." The man didn't respond, his attention focused on breathing through the pain. Bill glanced back in the mirror occasionally, watching as his passenger closed his eyes, his brow furrowed. He felt a brief flicker of something, a strange, uncomfortable feeling he couldn't quite place. But he brushed it off, focusing on the road ahead. They drove in silence for a few blocks, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the cab as it hit potholes. Bill glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing how the young man's hands were trembling slightly as he held his stomach. The discomfort on his face was unmistakable, yet he made no complaints, no pleas for sympathy. "What's the matter with you, anyway?" Bill asked, his tone laced with a mix of skepticism and irritation. "Get into some bad food?" The man shook his head, wincing as another wave of pain seemed to hit him. "I don't know, just need to get it checked out." Bill rolled his eyes, a part of him still convinced this was some elaborate scheme. "Right. Well, let's hope you don't pass out back there. Not in the mood for any theatrics tonight." For a moment, the man looked up, meeting Bill's gaze in the rearview mirror with a look that caught him off guard. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was something softer, something that almost looked like disappointment. Bill felt a jolt, his grip on the wheel tightening as he looked away, focusing on the road. The cab rolled to a stop at a red light, and for a brief moment, they sat in silence, the city quiet around them. The young man leaned his head back, eyes closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Bill found himself watching him in the mirror, a strange discomfort settling over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd crossed a line, that his usual jabs and sarcastic comments had fallen flat in a way he hadn't expected. Something about this passenger felt different, as if there was a story here that he hadn't bothered to see. But before he could dwell on it, the light turned green, and he pressed the gas, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. When they finally reached the hospital, Bill pulled up to the entrance, the cab coming to a stop with a slight lurch. He glanced back at the young man, his hand already on the meter. "Well, here we are. Time to get out." The young man nodded, wincing as he reached for the door handle. He moved slowly, his face contorted in pain as he climbed out of the cab, his movements careful and deliberate. Bill watched him, a flicker of something close to guilt rising in his chest. "Hey, don't take all day," Bill muttered, tapping his fingers on the wheel, trying to shake the feeling. "Got other places to be." The young man paused, turning back to look at Bill one last time. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, just a quiet, tired expression that seemed to see right through him. It was a look that Bill couldn't quite decipher, a look that lingered even as the man turned and made his way toward the hospital doors. Bill watched him disappear into the building, a strange unease settling over him. He'd had plenty of difficult passengers over the years, plenty of people who'd tested his patience. But something about this encounter felt different, as if he'd been confronted with a side of himself he didn't want to acknowledge. With a sigh, He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the feeling. "Doesn't matter," he muttered, putting the car in gear and pulling away from the curb. "Just another passenger. Nothing special." But as he drove through the quiet, empty streets, that look, the quiet, disappointed look the young man had given him, stayed with him, like a splinter he couldn't shake. It was as if, in that brief moment, he'd been reminded of a truth he'd spent years trying to ignore. As he continued his shift, picking up and dropping off passengers, Bill couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that had settled over him. He'd had thousands of encounters over the years, brief, transactional exchanges that came and went without leaving a trace. But this one lingered, a quiet weight pressing down on him, reminding him of something he couldn't quite name. Later that night, as he sat alone in his apartment, he found himself thinking back to Laura's words. "Don't let the world make you hard, Bill. Kindness is free." For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if she'd been right, if maybe he'd let his bitterness overshadow the man he'd once been. He thought of the young man's quiet endurance, the way he'd accepted Bill's coldness without complaint, without anger. And he wondered for the first time if he'd been wrong. Bill's usual workday began like any other. Stale coffee, a weary sigh, and the familiar drive to the company lot. But today felt different. There was a buzz among the drivers, an unusual energy that he picked up on the moment he walked through the door. Groups of drivers stood huddled around, whispering in low voices, their expressions ranging from curiosity to cautious excitement. He narrowed his eyes, watching as Marla, the company's HR manager, moved through the crowd, clipboard in hand. Her face was tense, her usual brisk demeanor softened with a hint of nervousness. Bill clenched his jaw, feeling his frustration bubble up. He hated change, especially at work, where any shift in routine felt like an inconvenience. He managed to corner one of the younger drivers, a guy named Luis, who'd been with the company for only a few months. "What's going on here?" Bill demanded, his voice a low grumble. Luis shrugged, his eyes darting around the room. "Apparently, there's a new CEO. We're supposed to meet him today. Heard he's going to shake things up around here." Bill rolled his eyes, a scowl settling on his face. "Great. Just what we need, some suit telling us how to do our jobs." He was used to executives cycling in and out, bringing grand ideas about morale and customer satisfaction without any real understanding of what it was like to be out there dealing with difficult customers day in and day out. He found his way to his usual spot in the back of the room, crossing his arms as he waited. A few more drivers filtered in, and the buzz grew louder, the air thick with anticipation and uncertainty. Marla cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the chatter. "All right, everyone, settle down," she called out. "I know you've all heard that we have new leadership, but I want to make sure you understand that this isn't just another management change. The new CEO is committed to reshaping this company, to making it a place where everyone is treated with respect, both customers and drivers." Bill scoffed under his breath, muttering to himself, "Yeah, right? Heard that before." But his irritation quickly turned to shock as Marla introduced the new CEO, Andre Caldwell. Bill's heart skipped a beat as he watched the same young man he'd driven to the hospital the other night step to the front of the room, dressed in a crisp suit, his face calm and composed. For a moment, Bill couldn't move, couldn't breathe, his mind whirling as he processed what he was seeing. Bill's disbelief turned into a sick, sinking feeling as Andre began to speak, his voice smooth, yet filled with a quiet authority that commanded the room's attention. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Andre Caldwell," he began, his gaze sweeping over the room, pausing briefly on Bill. "I'm honored to lead this company, and I want you to know that my primary goal is to create an environment of respect and dignity for everyone here." Bill shifted uncomfortably, feeling a prickling sensation crawl up his neck. He could barely believe what he was hearing, that the man he'd dismissed as a nobody, a mere passenger, was now his boss. He couldn't shake the memory of his behavior in the cab, the sarcasm, the indifference, the utter lack of compassion. Andre continued, his tone both gentle and firm. "I grew up in this city. I know what it's like to struggle, to feel unseen. I want to change that. My goal is to build a company culture that treats every person with respect, no matter their background, no matter their role. Bill felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger, a confusing mix of shame and resentment swirling inside him. Part of him wanted to storm out, to leave the room before Andre's words dug any deeper. But he was rooted to his spot, watching as his colleagues nodded along, their expressions filled with admiration. He barely heard the rest of Andre's speech, his mind consumed by the realization of his mistake. He'd treated Andre with contempt, and now he was facing the consequences. The shame gnawed at him, but he pushed it down, telling himself that it didn't matter, that Andre would be just another boss with lofty ideals and no real impact. After the meeting, Bill tried to slip out quietly, hoping to avoid any further interaction. But as he reached the door, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Marla, her expression unreadable. "Bill," she said, her voice firm, "Andre wants to speak with you. Please come with me." Bill's stomach twisted, his mind racing with dread. He followed Marla down the hall, his steps heavy, his thoughts a jumbled mess of frustration and regret. He'd spent years building up walls, protecting himself from any sense of vulnerability or accountability. Now, it felt like those walls were crumbling, exposing him in a way he hadn't anticipated. When they reached the small conference room, Andre was waiting, his expression calm but serious. He gestured for Bill to sit, and though every part of him wanted to leave, Bill found himself sinking into the chair, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Andre studied him for a moment before speaking. "Bill, I wanted to talk to you about our interaction the other night." Bill shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed. "Look, I was just doing my job," he muttered, avoiding Andre's gaze. Andre's expression remained steady, his gaze unwavering. "I understand that driving can be a tough job, but part of that job is treating people with respect. You didn't know who I was, but that doesn't change the fact that you treated me, and perhaps others, with unnecessary hostility." Bill's face burned with shame, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. He'd grown so used to justifying his actions, to telling himself that his behavior didn't matter. But here, in this moment, he couldn't escape the truth. "I'm giving you a formal warning," Andre continued, his tone gentle but firm. "I believe in second chances, Bill, but I need to see that you're willing to change. This company is moving in a new direction, and I want you to be part of that journey, if you're willing." Bill nodded stiffly, a lump forming in his throat as he forced out a gruff, "Understood." But as he left the room, his emotions twisted inside him. He felt humiliated, angry, but also something else, something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. In the weeks that followed, Bill's discomfort only grew. Andre's presence loomed over the company, his new policies reshaping the work environment. Weekly meetings became the norm, as did customer feedback reports and team-building exercises focused on empathy and respect. For most of the drivers, it was a welcome change. They appreciated Andre's commitment to building a positive culture. But for Bill, each new policy felt like a personal attack, a constant reminder of the mistakes he'd made and the values he'd rejected. He found himself withdrawing further, watching as his colleagues embraced the changes with enthusiasm while he felt like an outsider, his resentment festering beneath the surface. One afternoon, during a break, he overheard a conversation between a few of the younger drivers who were discussing Andre's background. "Did you know he used to work with kids in after-school programs?" one of them said, his voice filled with admiration. "Guy's got a heart for helping people." Another driver chimed in, nodding. "Yeah, he's been through a lot himself. Grew up with barely anything, worked his way through college, and now he's running this place." Bill clenched his fists, feeling a surge of frustration. He wanted to dismiss their words, to write Andre off as just another idealist who didn't understand the real world. But a part of him, buried deep beneath layers of bitterness, felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, something that felt uncomfortably like admiration. At one of the company's weekly meetings, Andre decided to share more about his past. He stood at the front of the room, his expression open and sincere as he spoke about the challenges he'd faced growing up in a rough neighborhood, the obstacles he'd overcome to reach his current position. "I know what it's like to feel dismissed," he said, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I know what it's like to be judged, to be seen as less than. That's why I'm committed to making this company a place where everyone, drivers and passengers alike, feels respected and valued. Bill felt a knot form in his chest as he listened. He'd spent so many years dismissing others, convinced that his struggles were somehow unique, that no one else could understand the hardships he'd endured. But hearing Andre's story forced him to confront the truth. He wasn't the only one who'd faced hardship, and he wasn't the only one who'd had to fight for respect. For the first time, he felt a flicker of empathy for Andre, a grudging acknowledgement of the strength it must have taken for him to rise above his circumstances. But that empathy was quickly overshadowed by a familiar sense of defensiveness, a voice in his head that told him he didn't need anyone's pity or understanding. Despite his attempts to resist the changes, Bill found himself slipping. His interactions with passengers grew colder, his patience thinner. One night, he picked up a young mother and her child, both of whom looked worn out, their clothes slightly tattered. As they climbed into the cab, he felt a surge of irritation, a familiar resentment simmering beneath the surface. "Rough night," he muttered under his breath, unable to stop himself. The woman looked at him, her expression one of quiet hurt, but she said nothing, simply holding her child closer. The silence in the cab was thick, each mile a reminder of the walls he'd built around himself, walls that now felt like a prison. By the time he dropped them off, he felt the weight of his words pressing down on him, a heavy, suffocating guilt that refused to be ignored. He knew he'd crossed a line, that his bitterness had cost him more than he'd realized. Later that night, Andre called him into his office, his expression filled with disappointment. "Bill, I've given you chances because I believe in your potential. But I need you to understand that your behavior has consequences, for you and for the people around you." Bill felt the sting of shame, his pride unable to shield him from the truth. He'd been given chances, and he'd squandered them. For the first time in years, he felt the full weight of his actions, a crushing realization that left him feeling hollow. Andre suspended Bill for a week, giving him time to reflect on his behavior. Alone in his apartment, Bill felt the silence press down on him, each day a reminder of the man he'd become. He thought of Laura, of the kindness she'd tried to instill in him, and felt a pang of regret so deep it left him breathless. He couldn't escape the feeling that he'd lost something valuable along the way, that he'd let his bitterness consume him to the point of no return. But as the days passed, he felt a quiet resolve growing within him, a resolve to change, to let go of the anger that had poisoned his life for so long. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing: he wasn't done trying. Bill's week of suspension felt like both a punishment and a blessing. On one hand, it gnawed him to know he was missing work, to feel like his reputation was damaged beyond repair. But on the other, it forced him to confront parts of himself he'd spent years trying to bury. Each day passed in silence, without the distraction of his usual routines, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his regrets. He paced his apartment, restless and agitated, his mind churning with memories of his most recent encounters with passengers. He thought of the mother and child he'd treated so coldly, the young man he'd mocked on his way to the hospital, and countless others who'd been on the receiving end of his resentment. He'd spent years justifying his bitterness, telling himself that his behavior didn't matter. But now he was beginning to question everything. One night, as he sat alone in his dark living room, he found himself looking at an old photograph of his late wife, Laura. In the picture, she was smiling, her eyes bright with kindness. She'd been the light in his life, the one person who'd always believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. He could almost hear her voice in his mind, the gentle tone she'd used whenever he'd been upset or angry. "Don't let the world make you hard, Bill," she used to say. "There's always a choice." Bill's throat tightened as he gazed at her image, feeling a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took his breath away. For so long, he'd carried his bitterness like a shield, a way to protect himself from the disappointments and frustrations of life. But now, he realized that shield had become a prison, trapping him in a cycle of anger and resentment. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if there was a way out, if he could still make a choice to change. When the week ended, Bill returned to work feeling a mixture of dread and resolve. He knew he couldn't go back to his old ways, but he also wasn't sure if he was ready to embrace Andre's vision. Part of him still resisted the idea of change, clinging to the familiar bitterness that had defined him for so long. During his first break, Andre approached him in the lounge, offering a warm, sincere smile. "Good to have you back, Bill," he said, his tone friendly but filled with a quiet strength. "How have you been?" Bill shrugged, feeling a pang of discomfort. "Fine," he muttered, unsure of what else to say. He half expected Andre to chastise him, to remind him of his mistakes, but instead, Andre's expression softened with understanding. "I know it's not easy to change," Andre said, his voice gentle but steady. "But I believe in you. I believe that you can become the man you want to be." Bill felt a lump form in his throat, a strange mix of gratitude and shame swirling inside him. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Andre reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Then let's take it one day at a time," he replied. "Kindness doesn't have to be grand gestures. Sometimes it's just a small choice to listen, to show patience, to give someone the benefit of the doubt." Bill nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He didn't know if he believed in himself, but for the first time he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could change. Determined to try, Bill approached his next few shifts with a cautious sense of purpose. He made a conscious effort to keep his tone neutral, to avoid the sarcastic remarks that had become his trademark. It felt awkward, unnatural, as if he were pretending to be someone he wasn't. But he told himself that each small effort mattered, that he could build a new version of himself, piece by piece. One evening, he picked up a young man named David, a high school teacher who was on his way home after a long day. David was chatty, his voice filled with enthusiasm as he talked about his students, about the challenges and joys of teaching. Normally, Bill would have tuned him out, maybe even snapped at him to keep quiet, but something in David's tone held him captive. David spoke about one of his students, a teenage boy who'd recently lost his father. "He's struggling," David said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "But I know he's got potential. I just have to keep showing up for him, you know? Show him that someone cares." Bill felt a pang of empathy, a feeling he hadn't experienced in so long it felt foreign. He thought of Andre, of the patience he'd shown, the belief he'd had in Bill even when Bill couldn't believe in himself. Without thinking, Bill found himself responding. "That's good of you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Not everyone would stick around." David looked at him, a smile spreading across his face. "Well, I think everyone deserves a chance, don't you?" Bill nodded, a strange warmth filling his chest. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a reminder that maybe, in some small way, he could make a difference too. At one of the weekly meetings, Andre encouraged the drivers to share stories of their most meaningful experiences with passengers. Bill listened as his colleagues recounted tales of late-night pickups, emergency rides, and simple acts of kindness that had left a lasting impact. Each story deepened his sense of isolation, a reminder of the walls he'd built around himself and the connections he'd lost. When it was his turn to share, he hesitated, unsure of what to say. Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice rough with uncertainty. "There was a couple a few years back," he began, his gaze fixed on the floor. "They were moving to another state, starting fresh. Talked my ear off the whole way." The room chuckled, and for the first time, Bill felt a hint of camaraderie. "When we got to their new place, they gave me this mug," he continued, his voice softening. "Said it was for the ride of a lifetime. Thought it was corny at the time, but I kept it. Guess it reminded me that maybe I'd done something good for once." Andre smiled, nodding with encouragement. "See, Bill? That's the kind of difference we can make even in small ways. Sometimes, the smallest gestures leave the biggest impact." Bill nodded, a quiet pride filling his chest. He hadn't thought of that mug in years, but now he realized why he'd kept it. It was a reminder of the man he could be, a man he hoped he could become again. Despite his efforts, old habits still lingered. One rainy night, he picked up a young black mother with her toddler. She was drenched from head to toe, her hair clinging to her face, her clothes soaked. She looked exhausted, but she smiled politely as she settled her child in the seat beside her. Bill felt an old, familiar frustration bubbling up as he watched her struggle with the car seat. He muttered under his breath, "Didn't think to bring an umbrella, did you?" The woman glanced up, her smile fading. She said nothing, but her eyes held a quiet disappointment that hit Bill harder than any angry retort. He felt a pang of regret almost immediately, but his pride wouldn't let him apologize. The silence between them was thick as he drove, each mile a reminder of the gap he still needed to close. When they finally arrived at her destination, she paid without a word, her expression a mix of hurt and resignation. As she walked away, Bill felt a wave of shame, a crushing realization that he'd failed yet again. He'd spent weeks trying to change, but in a moment of weakness, he'd fallen back into old patterns, hurting someone who didn't deserve it. The next morning, Andre called him into his office, his expression somber as he gestured for Bill to sit. Bill braced himself for the worst, his stomach tight with dread. "Bill, I've been patient with you," Andre said, his voice calm but firm. "But I can't keep giving you chances if you're not willing to take them seriously. Your behavior last night was unacceptable." Bill looked down, his face flushed with shame. He'd expected anger, maybe even a lecture, but Andre's disappointment was far worse. I don't know why I did it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just hard to change." Andre nodded, a hint of sympathy in his gaze. "I know it is, but if you truly want to be part of this company, you need to be willing to let go of the anger that's holding you back." He paused, his expression softening. "I'm not giving up on you, Bill, but this is your last chance. I want you to spend a day with me, shadowing me on my rounds. Maybe seeing things from a different perspective will help." Bill nodded, too humbled to argue. He'd never felt this vulnerable, this exposed, but a part of him welcomed the challenge. He didn't know if he could change, but for the first time, he was willing to try. The next day, Bill met Andre at a local community center where he volunteered on weekends. Andre led him through the bustling building, introducing him to staff members, volunteers, and families who had come for support. Bill watched as Andre greeted each person with genuine kindness, taking the time to listen and offer words of encouragement. At one point, a teenage boy approached Andre, thanking him for helping him find a part-time job. "I was lost before," the boy said, his voice filled with gratitude. "But you gave me hope." Bill listened, his heart heavy with a mixture of regret and admiration. He realized that Andre's kindness wasn't just a facade. It was real, rooted in a desire to make a difference. And for the first time, Bill felt a deep longing to be part of that difference. As they left the center, Bill turned to Andre, his voice raw with vulnerability. "How do you do it? How do you care about all these people?" Andre smiled, his gaze steady. "I see myself in them. We all have struggles, Bill, but we also have the power to make each other's lives a little easier, a little brighter." Bill nodded, feeling the weight of Andre's words settle over him. He realized that he'd spent so much time building walls, distancing himself from others, that he'd forgotten how to see people as human beings. But now, for the first time, he was ready to try. Bill's first day back after shadowing Andre was filled with a quiet resolve. He woke early, taking a moment to savor the morning light streaming through his apartment window. For years, he'd started each day with a sense of dread, a weight pressing on him as he anticipated the usual grind. But today felt different. He was beginning to see that the work he did and the way he treated people could mean something. As he walked into the break room at work, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him. He knew that they'd all seen his struggles, his outbursts, and his reluctance to embrace Andre's vision. A few drivers offered cautious nods, and he gave a small nod back, his face calm but determined. That day, he took extra care with each passenger, listening instead of dismissing, observing instead of assuming. It was challenging, but he found himself drawn to the small gestures of kindness that had once seemed insignificant. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. His first passenger, a young woman on her way to a job interview, thanked him for his patience as she stumbled through directions, clearly nervous. Bill offered a few reassuring words, something he wouldn't have done before. She left the cab with a grateful smile, and Bill felt a quiet pride blooming in his chest. With each ride, each passenger, he felt the weight of his bitterness lighten, replaced by a growing sense of connection. It was as if a layer of fog had lifted, allowing him to see the people he'd once ignored as individuals, each carrying their own burdens and dreams. Word of Bill's transformation spread through the company. Drivers who had once kept their distance began to approach him with a newfound respect, some even sharing their own stories of struggle and perseverance. Caleb, one of the younger drivers, often stopped by during breaks, asking for advice and sharing stories about his own experiences on the road. One afternoon, Caleb approached Bill with a look of admiration. "You know, Bill," he said, leaning against the break room counter, "when I first started, I never thought this job could mean anything. But watching you change, it's given me hope that maybe I can make a difference too." Bill looked at him, feeling a deep sense of humility. He'd never thought of himself as a role model, never imagined that his journey could inspire others. But hearing Caleb's words, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that he wasn't just changing for himself. He was setting an example for others, showing them that kindness and respect weren't just words. They were choices that could transform lives. From that day on, Bill made it a point to share his story with the newer drivers, offering them advice and guidance when they faced difficult passengers or struggled with their own frustrations. He spoke openly about his mistakes, his regrets, and the journey he was still on, finding strength in his vulnerability. Bill's efforts to change weren't always easy. He still faced moments of frustration, still felt the urge to snap or retreat into his old habits. But he found that each act of kindness, no matter how small, strengthened his resolve. One evening, he picked up an elderly woman named Mrs. Green. She was heading to a local theater to see a play, her face alight with excitement as she described the show to Bill. As they drove, she shared stories of her late husband, their love for theater, and the memories they'd created together. Her warmth reminded Bill of Laura, and he felt a pang of both sadness and gratitude. When they reached the theater, Mrs. Green struggled with her purse, her hands shaky as she searched for her wallet. Bill stopped her gently, saying, "Don't worry about it, ma'am. This one's on me." Mrs. Green looked up, her eyes misty with gratitude. "Thank you, young man," she said softly. "It's rare to find kindness like yours these days." Bill watched her walk toward the theater, a warmth spreading through his chest. He realized that he wasn't just changing for himself. He was creating moments of light for others, moments that could ripple out in ways he couldn't even imagine. As Bill's transformation continued, Andre took note of his progress. Observing the way Bill's demeanor had softened, the way he'd become a source of support for the other drivers. One afternoon, Andre called Bill into his office, his face breaking into a smile as he gestured for Bill to take a seat. "I've been watching you, Bill," Andre said, his voice filled with pride. "You've come a long way, and I want you to know that your efforts haven't gone unnoticed." Bill shifted in his seat, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. "Thanks," he muttered, looking down at his hands. "Just trying to make things right." Andre nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And you've set an example for everyone here, Bill. You've shown us that change is possible, that it's never too late to choose kindness over bitterness." He paused, his gaze steady. "I'd like you to take on a new role here, something that would allow you to share your journey and mentor other drivers. I believe you'd be an invaluable guide to those just starting out." Bill's heart swelled with pride, a sense of fulfillment settling over him. He'd never imagined himself as a mentor, but he realized that this was the natural next step in his journey, a way to give back to the company and the people who had given him a second chance. "I'd be honored," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Andre reached across the desk, offering his hand. "Thank you, Bill. You've made a difference here, and I know you'll continue to do so." In his new role, Bill began to see the world through a different lens. He spent time with the new drivers, listening to their stories, sharing his own, and encouraging them to see each passenger as an opportunity to make a positive impact. He found himself drawn to their struggles and triumphs, feeling a sense of kinship and camaraderie he hadn't felt in years. One driver, a young woman named Jasmine, confided in him about her struggles balancing work and family. Her voice was tinged with exhaustion as she described her long shifts, her worries about her children, and her fear of falling short. Bill listened intently, offering her a reassuring smile. "I used to think this job was just a way to make ends meet," he told her. "But it's more than that. Every ride, every passenger, it's a chance to show kindness, to make someone's day a little brighter. And that kindness has a way of coming back to you." Jasmine nodded, her face softening as she absorbed his words. She left their conversation with a renewed sense of purpose, her smile a little brighter, her posture a little straighter. Watching her go, Bill felt a surge of pride, knowing that he was part of something bigger than himself, a legacy of respect, a ripple of kindness that would continue long after he was gone. As Bill's transformation deepened, he found himself returning to the places and people he'd once overlooked. He visited the neighborhood he'd grown up in, walking through the familiar streets with a newfound appreciation for the resilience and strength of the people who lived there. He reached out to old friends he'd lost touch with, offering apologies and seeking forgiveness for the ways he'd let his bitterness cloud their relationships. One day, he decided to visit the community center where Andre volunteered, curious to see the place that had inspired so many of Andre's values. The moment he stepped inside, he was greeted by the sight of families gathered together, volunteers offering support, and children laughing as they played. The center was filled with warmth and acceptance, a place where everyone was seen and valued. As he walked through the center, he ran into Andre, who was helping a group of teenagers with homework. When Andre saw Bill, his face lit up with a smile, and he crossed the room to greet him with a handshake. "Bill, great to see you," Andre said, his voice filled with genuine happiness. "How have you been?" Bill smiled, feeling a sense of peace. "Better," he replied, his voice steady. "Just wanted to see what this place is all about. I can see why you love it here." Andre nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a place where people can come as they are, where they're valued no matter what they've been through. It's a reminder that we're all connected, that kindness and empathy can make all the difference." Bill looked around the room, feeling a quiet sense of pride in knowing he was part of that legacy, that he was helping to create a world where kindness wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. In the months that followed, Bill's transformation continued to deepen, and his story became part of the company's history. New drivers heard tales of Old Man Thompson, a man who had transformed from a hardened cynic into a symbol of kindness and resilience. They looked to him as a mentor, a guide, someone who had walked the hard road and come out the other side. Bill felt a sense of fulfillment that he'd never known, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his journey had left a positive impact. He continued to work, helping others, offering guidance, and sharing his story with anyone who needed a reminder that change was possible. As he neared retirement, Andre invited him to speak at the company's annual meeting, hoping that his story would inspire others to embrace the values he'd come to embody. Bill stood before a room filled with drivers, dispatchers, and staff, each of them listening intently as he spoke about his journey, his mistakes, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. "I wasn't always this way," he began, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "I spent years living with anger, bitterness, and regret. But I realized that life doesn't have to be that way. Every day, we have a choice to see others with kindness, to treat people with respect. It's a choice that can change everything." The room erupted in applause, and Bill felt a wave of humility and pride wash over him. He had come full circle, from a man hardened by bitterness to someone who could inspire others to choose compassion. It had been nearly a month since Bill Thompson retired from his job as a taxi driver, and life had taken on a slower, simpler rhythm. Each morning, he'd wake up with the sunrise, stretch his arms, and take a moment to let the stillness settle over him. His apartment, filled with mementos of his life, felt warmer now. The clutter of old receipts and newspapers had been replaced by plants Laura would have loved, and books that reminded him of the lessons he'd learned along his journey. One morning, as he sipped his coffee by the window, watching the early commuters bustling below, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. It was a peace he hadn't known in years, a feeling that he'd finally become the man he'd always hoped he could be. Just as he was finishing his coffee, he heard a knock at the door. Setting his mug aside, he opened it to find Caleb standing there, a warm smile on his face. "Hey, Bill." I hope I'm not disturbing you, Caleb said, stepping inside when Bill invited him in. Not at all, Bill replied, gesturing for Caleb to sit. Good to see you. How's the company doing? Still the same, Caleb said with a laugh. But we all miss you around there. Everyone's always talking about Old Man Thompson and how he's the one who made the place what it is today. Bill chuckled, a bit embarrassed but deeply touched. They're giving me more credit than I deserve. Caleb shook his head. No, Bill. You earned it. You gave all of us a reason to look at the job differently, to see each passenger as more than just a fare. You made us realize that we have the power to make someone's day a little better, and that's something we won't forget. Bill nodded, feeling a wave of humility and gratitude. He'd never imagined himself as an inspiration, but Caleb's words filled him with a sense of pride, a sense that all the struggles, the hard days, and the painful self-reflection had been worth it. A few days after Caleb's visit, Bill found himself thinking back to the community center where he'd shadowed Andre, the place that had sparked his understanding of kindness and connection. He decided to pay a visit, curious to see how things had changed and to perhaps lend a hand. When he stepped into the building, he was greeted by a bustling, lively scene. Children laughed as they played games in the corner, families gathered for support meetings, and volunteers moved around, helping and friendly smiles. Bill felt an instant sense of warmth, as if he'd entered a place that was more than just a building. It was a community. As he wandered through the center, he saw Andre talking to a group of teenagers, offering them advice and encouragement as they worked on job applications. When Andre noticed Bill, his face lit up, and he crossed the room to greet him with a firm handshake and a welcoming smile. Bill, great to see you, Andre said, his voice filled with genuine happiness. How's retirement treating you? Bill smiled, feeling a sense of peace. It's good, peaceful. Thought I'd stop by and see the place again, maybe help out if you need it. Andre's smile widened. We could always use more hands around here, and I think a lot of these kids could benefit from hearing your story. Bill hesitated, but Andre's words reminded him of how far he'd come. He knew he still had something to offer, something that could help others find their own paths to kindness and understanding. Andre introduced Bill to a group of young people who gathered around, curious and attentive as Bill began to speak. He felt a mix of nerves and pride, his voice steady as he shared his journey, the bitterness that had once consumed him, the mistakes he'd made, and the painful but transformative realization that kindness was a choice. The young people listened intently, their faces thoughtful as they absorbed his words. One girl, no older than 16, raised her hand. Was it hard to let go of the anger? She asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Bill nodded, his gaze steady. Hardest thing I ever did, but every time I chose kindness over anger, it got a little easier. And now, I'm proud of the person I've become. That's a feeling worth fighting for. Another young man spoke up, his voice hesitant but hopeful. Do you think people can really change, even if they've made a lot of mistakes? Bill smiled, his heart full. Absolutely. We're all capable of change. It doesn't matter how many mistakes you've made. It's about the choices you make going forward. After he finished speaking, a few of the young people came up to thank him, their faces filled with gratitude and admiration. Bill felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that his story could inspire others to choose compassion, to find their own paths to redemption. Months later, Andre reached out to Bill with a special invitation. The company was holding an annual gathering, and he wanted Bill to be the keynote speaker, to share his journey and inspire the new drivers who were just beginning their careers. Bill agreed, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement as he prepared to speak. On the day of the event, he stood before a room full of drivers, dispatchers, and staff, many of whom had heard of him but had never met him in person. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settle over him as he looked out at the faces in the crowd. I wasn't always this way, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I spent years living with bitterness, anger, and regret. I saw people as problems to be dealt with, obstacles in my way. But I learned that life doesn't have to be that way. Every day, we have a choice to see others with kindness, to treat people with respect. It's a choice that can change everything. The room was silent, each person hanging on his words as he spoke about the lessons he'd learned, the people who had helped him, and the power of kindness to transform lives. Kindness doesn't have to be grand gestures, he said. Sometimes it's just a smile, a word of encouragement, a small act that says, "I see you and I care." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Bill felt a wave of humility and pride, knowing that he had come full circle, from a man hardened by bitterness to someone who could inspire others to choose compassion. After the speech, several drivers approached him, eager to thank him for his words and share their own struggles. Bill listened to each one, offering advice, encouragement, and a sense of solidarity. He felt a renewed sense of connection, a reminder that his story was part of something bigger, something that would continue to inspire others long after he was gone. In the weeks that followed, Bill continued to visit the community center, sharing his story with anyone who needed to hear it and offering guidance to those who struggled with anger, bitterness, or a sense of being lost. He found peace in these simple acts of kindness, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his journey had left a lasting impact. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment settle over him. He thought of Laura, of the kindness she had always believed in, and knew that he had finally become the man she'd seen in him. The anger and bitterness that had once consumed him had been replaced by a quiet strength, a resilience born from years of choosing compassion over resentment. He took a final look at the city he'd once seen as a place of hardship and now saw as a place of hope. He knew that his story would live on through the people he'd touched, through the drivers he'd mentored, and through the community he'd helped build. And in those quiet moments, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he'd left a legacy of kindness, a legacy that would continue to inspire others long after he was gone. As the stars began to twinkle above, Bill closed his eyes, feeling a warmth that came from knowing he'd found his purpose. He had finally learned the lesson Laura had always tried to teach him, that kindness was a choice that could change everything. As you finish this story, I hope Bill's journey has left an impact, showing that change is possible for all of us, no matter where we start. If you're inspired by stories of redemption, growth, and the power of kindness, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. Every story has the potential to inspire and remind us that our smallest choices can create the biggest changes. So, join our community and let's keep spreading empathy, one story at a time. Subscribe now and stay tuned for more stories that celebrate compassion, transformation, and the journey to becoming our best selves.